just our infrastructure, but also a lot of our tourism reasons of why people come here. We're the closest as far as a U.S. destination for a lot of our tourists within Asia. But some of the challenges are also because we can't compete in Southeast Asia, so because of cost. And so does that mean less or more for us as a people? And I think that's a really big question we have to ask ourselves. There are more things to put to chance with regards to this. And again, I think it's a very personal question. That's why it's a little hard to be up here to represent an organization, because we don't have a position on it. But however, I think we can all objectively give our own opinions with regards how it will impact private sector and industry and the island and the people of Guam.
Just like our organization, we also don't have an official position on that, but just to talk a little bit, I mean, it's not a conversation that you normally have in the boardroom or among your business partners. Talk about decolonization, and maybe it should be that. But I think there may be some misconception about decolonization. When you talk to our folks, at least in construction, the first thing they think about is independence. Guam wants to be independent of the U.S., and that's not the case. And I think that's where the misinformation comes in, and perhaps misleading to some of the folks in the business. But I think there should be more conversation about that. I think most people fear, I guess, the uncertainties of whatever we decide, whether it be statehood, independence, or a free association. And I think those three types of political stances aren't really explained well, at least in our circles, and that we don't have that conversation on a normal basis. So events like this would probably give us more of that information, but like I said, it's not really a topic that is easily talked about or even considered whether we talk business or around our boardroom, and maybe it's a conversation that we need to start, because times are changing, and that could be a change that we need to prepare ourselves for in terms of business and business development.
Thank you, James. Carl, I guess we kind of see the benefit of having these different organizations come together. We see passion, we see pure definition, we see how it affects the industries that they're in, we see an economist standpoint. So I guess the collective result from this is that self-determination and decolonization coincide with each other, and there's many definitions depending on who's giving the definition or the perception. And that's the goal that we have today, is to get a better education on self-determination.
So I'm going to go ahead and pose the second question, and this is open to everybody else, the whole panel. What are your concerns for your organization about self-determination and decolonization? Should Guam achieve such status? Do you need me to say it again?
No, I think we get it, but the we all represent business industry. The biggest obstacle to investment is uncertainty, and the more you can bring certainty to an issue, then it's easier for a business to decide whether to invest or not to invest in that jurisdiction or that location in this case. So finally achieving decolonization vote here brings certainty to the issue of where the island is headed or where it's going, and it allows private industry to then be able to better judge whether or not they're going to invest. And all different positions bring different advantages and disadvantages for different business and industries. So do you want to have self-determination? I think the private sector will say, if you're talking about certainty on the colonial status or not colonial status, towards statehood or towards independence, I think business will welcome finally putting the issue down to rest. And then we'll live with whatever decision it is. The Chamber of Commerce is not going to go anywhere. We're still going to represent private industry in this island, no matter what status is there. We can have different opinions of which one we feel would be more of an economic driver for our industries that we represent, but outside that, it shouldn't be an issue. At least that's my point of view.
I think a good example is what's happening in Europe. There's been a lot of turmoil the last couple of years with regards to England's moving away from the European Union, and even they have had a difficult time with that, and it has affected their financial, not just forecasts, but even just how they're performing, and whether or not businesses want to stay within England or not. So I think that's a good current example of how a decision like that, again, impacts the whole economy. I think that Guam has had its challenges in bringing this to really up for discussion, and then again, the kinds of impacts. There are several things that really will impact not just private sector, but us as a people with the tax-based system of how we report and pay taxes, not just from a corporate side, but also personal income. How we pay for, how would we replace our federal services that we get so much money from? With regards to the United States, they subsidize so much of our government budget today, and they provide a lot of the public services, social welfare, and things like that, is not a private sector thing. It's very much a government issue. But with regards to private sector, it would address certain things that would impact and possibly give us benefits, like immigration rules that we can come up with our own. We've had challenges, even Guam and Saipan recently with Border Patrol, that impacts us, whether or not it's bringing in labor or allowing tourist visas or not. So there are a lot of things that would be on the table, and I think that we collectively have to just put that all together and try to understand what are the benefits, but also the consequences of those decisions, and how can we project the financial impact it will have, and can we replace those with our own economies of scale of whether or not they are truly replaceable. Because I think we have some challenges with that in how we manage government in itself. So really the financial impact would be the greatest, I think, both in the tax-based system, but also in a lot of other things that we are governed by with the U.S. government. Tourism isn't really just our largest industry. We have also the military funding that takes place on Guam, and the future of that, considering we are called the tip of the spear, and a lot of the construction projects, it's a feast or famine with regards to tourism being up or the military being up. Construction relies heavily on military projects, Department of Defense funding, as well as non-appropriated fund funding, especially with tourism, when we do rely on a lot of the military business during non-peak seasons and during peak season as well, with all the military exercises and people here to help with the buildup. So there are a lot of things that go into all of that, but it's way more than my 4 minutes that's allowed.
Thank you.
Just to pick up where Mary left off, I think that's a very good place to start is what is the next step? We've talked, the task force have talked about the various options, statehood, independence, and free association, but what is the next step for the people once you're in either of those options, right? So we need to look at whether or not, how it's going to affect us in terms of our tax base, how is it going to affect us in terms of public service, how are those services going to be delivered, whether it's education, it's safety, it's public health, and how do we get access to resources? So we're sort of in this place now where we're talking about the different options that are available to us, but I think what we need to be looking at going forward is what's next, because it's all going to be part of the education process, and it's going to be part of engagement. If we're going to engage the community on an island-wide basis as to the topics and the issues that are affecting us, then we have to talk about more than just the political status. We have to talk about what each of those levels of status are going to mean for our community.
Can I sort of add to that? Other two things. One, closer to home, Hong Kong, look right now at the uncertainty that the situation there has created as businesses start exiting the Hong Kong. Who would have thought about it, right? The second issue is, I think you need to decide first, what are we voting on, right? Are we voting on the self-determination of the Chamorro people and where they want to go? And then that's your next step, and how you go through that process. You can get money from the HHS, AANA office will fund that entirely. But if you end up going and saying, well, what I want to do is a decolonization process, and I want to decolonize Guam, I want to go to independence, Commonwealth, or free association, you're going to find a couple of obstacles. One is, at least in the, I brought these books because I gave it to each one of the students because I want the young people to be educated on history. And this goes through the entire history that's gone in Puerto Rico till now. Every single plebiscite, the Supreme Court ends up ruling that you need to have all options. And if you don't include the present status, they're gonna require you to put none of the above in there. And in one of our plebiscites, none of the above won, because that was the option that everybody said, well, we don't want to look there. So for me, it's first you need to choose. You have people, the Navajo Nation are in 4 states. You have the Chippewa are in around 8 states and in Canada as a people. So, you know, you ask me for the Chamorro population in Guam, and I keep saying, well, what happened to the Chamorro population in Northern Mariana Islands? If there's going to be self-determination of the Chamorro people, it should be of all the people. It's not just for a sector of it. And when you look at what you want to have as your tribal lands, or what you're going to be asking to, should they decide that they want to go through independence, then that's an entire negotiation that goes with the federal government. So when you ask about the next steps, there's a lot of next steps, and we really need to think about where do we want to go.
Hong Kong. I mean, I know it gets a little wild and agate on a Saturday night, but this is not Hong Kong, what's going on over there. This is something much different. I think you have to add in status quo as one of the choices. If you're going to be a statehood, all of a sudden then the money that we're paying to Agania is going to be gone to Philadelphia or Fresno, wherever the IRS collects money. How are we going to support ourselves here? Are we going to have increased tax burden on ourselves? If we go to free association, which is really another form of independence, I'll just skip that. If we go to independence first, then in my mind, it's never going to happen. There's too many people who actually like being Americans. And if it was, we were talking about, Joe and I, over breakfast this morning, what would it mean for the banking community? We have no idea. Would we be able to keep our FDIC insurance on your deposit accounts? Probably. Would there be new banks coming into Guam and the FDIC would give them insurance? Probably not. And people forget that banks' money is fungible. And if you go back a little bit in your memory, you know, Bank of Guam and Bank Pacific were not like your power and water that's always going to be there, or at least most of the time. But banks come and go. I'm going to give a quick history of Organic Act and how the Start Bank got going. My grandfather left Guam in 1917, joined the Navy, settled in California in 1920, and moved back to Guam, worked with his brothers after the Second War, 47, 48. And then we went from subject to citizens, and you're right, subject is a pretty lousy term, but when we became citizens of the United States with the hard work of people like B.J. Verdallo, the Navy started selling its assets. They sold, one of the first things they sold was their newspaper. When my grandfather was in California, even in San Francisco, he had 7 newspapers, neighborhood newspapers, advertisers. You didn't subscribe to them. People paid the advertisements, and you just scattered them around. And then the Navy wanted to sell the Bank of Guam, not the Bank of Guam as we know it now, but the Navy Bank of Guam. And my grandfather went together with his hui, you know, with the gangs, and they said, okay, we'll buy it. And the Office of the Controller of Currency said, no, you can't have it, you don't know anything about banking, and they gave it to Bank of America. My grandfather had a friend in San Francisco who had a company called Big East Savings and Loan Association. Elwood Hansen was his name. Elwood, how do I do an SNL? You told him. In 1954, my grandfather opened up Guam Savings and Loan Association. Over the years, Bank of Hawaii came, First Hawaiian came, Chase Manhattan Bank came, Citibank came. I'm going to go on. And then in 1973, Joe, Uncle Lon and Susleon Guerrero, the geniuses that they were, started the Bank of Guam. And then a little later on, Kurt Moore and some friends started Citizen Security, which is now ANZ. But over the years, we've seen more banks come and go. There are only 5 of us now. And there's probably been like 10, 15 that have come and gone. So banks don't stick around unless there's a reason to stick around. Joe and I have no reason to leave because where we're going to go. And I'm not saying the Hawaii banks will leave because they're great banks. I'm not saying the Melbourne Bank would leave because they're a good bank, but banks come and go. Citibank only left about 2 or 3 Christmases ago. And so if you have something here where the economy is not good, and if you had an independence, in my mind, the economy is going to go down the toilet in a second. You're not going to get those tourists who want to come to Guam because it's America. You're not going to get the regulation that you need for EPA. You're not going to get the regulation that you need to regulate the banks, and you're going to see money leave. Guam has a classic case of capital leakage. I go this afternoon, I'm going to Payless, I'm going to go buy some milk. I pay Payless money for the milk. Payless sends that money to some guy in Los Angeles, Long Beach, or San Francisco to buy the milk or buy the next carton of milk. That's money that we have, and it's leaking out every day. That's just the nature of our economy. And if we became independent, it would become much worse because not as much money would be coming in. So as you can guess, I'm for either status quo or statehood.
My turn. What was the question?
So question number 2 was, what are your concerns for your organization about self-determination and decolonization? Should Guam achieve such status?
Okay, one of my thoughts right off the top is that we keep talking about achieving a status. We're looking at the end game principles, whereas to me, there's an awful lot of process that comes between here and there. And I think that that's something that most people have not really considered, at least very clearly. Statehood is pretty well defined, but it's still a negotiated status. The federal government has relationships with 50 states, and some of them are commonwealths. Some of them, like Texas, and part of their statehood agreement is, oh, they can separate into 4 separate states. Wow. Free association is clearly a negotiated status. In fact, the Marshals, the FSM, and the Republic of Palau will be in negotiations to renew their free association with the United States over the course of the next 4 years. And those statuses will be renegotiated each time. There's already a foundation, so there may be only a little bit of tweaking from one to the next. But nonetheless, it's a negotiated, it's a contract or a compact. Independence, well, even with free association, we have to have a set of laws and regulations right out of the gate. Just, it's not a switch is going to be flipped and suddenly we're freely associated. There's a lot of preparation that needs to be done, not just in terms of the negotiations with the federal government, but also in terms of preparing ourselves internally, our own set of internal ways in which businesses will relate to one another, in which the government will operate and fund itself. I think that in each of the 3 statuses, funding of government is going to be a substantial issue that I don't think anybody's really thought a lot about. Independence gives Guam the greatest latitude. It would be, I suppose it would be great to be an independent sovereign nation. However, certain physical conditions kind of require that be very carefully considered. For one, we're a small remote island. The Navy's rules for taking a high island, well, the guy who wrote those rules, wrote that book, was sitting up on Mount Lutam day after day after day after day after day as he was drafting the drafting process. And the conclusion was that a high island is not a defensible place. So as an independent nation, Guam would have to have defense agreements with one or more other nations, more powerful nations that could afford to defend the civilian community here. And I think I've already taken more than my 4 minutes, so I'll say more about these things some of the time.
Thank you.
A lot of times we talk about uncertainty and think that that's the biggest concern, is uncertainty and stability. And I think if you're looking at companies who come and want to invest in Guam, they look at those 2 things. First of all, how's our economy? is it sustainable? And second is, I guess, the protections of the U.S. and national security. So if uncertainty is in the air, I don't think you're going to get a lot of people that be interested in Guam until everything settles, and whether our determination is for statehood or free association or independence, I think that remains to be seen. But that's where I think the investors would hold off. When you consider the U.S. brings in about 50% of our total annual government budget, that's a scary thought when you think if we go independence. What's going to happen to that 50% of the revenues that are currently coming into Guam? That includes your SNAP benefits, your monies that go to the University of Guam, GCC, DOE, Medicaid, GURA, all these financial support and revenues that we get from the federal government. If we decide to go independence, are there any assurances that some of those income that already come to Guam are going to stay on Guam or continue to come to Guam, or is it going to be tailored down to close to nothing if we choose that? Statehood probably be the least change. Everything would be similar to status quo, but not really. I guess we get to vote for president. That's what pretty much everybody's concerned about these days. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's really hard to predict how it's going to impact business until we get to that point. And that's when we can decide, well, what are we looking at? But I think one of the scariest thing that a lot of businesses look at is stability and the uncertainty of how is Guam going to be able to sustain itself financially? Are we capable of running paying for $1 billion of annual budget to pay for services that the government provides and other things? We don't have to depend any longer on the 50% that the U.S. or the federal government gives to Guam. That's close to about $500 million. So again, the uncertainty's there and stability. The other thing that I also see is controlling our borders. As you know, we've got a problem with bringing in foreign skilled labor. That's been a big challenge. Now they've banned one of our closest allies, at least locally, with the Philippines, that are no longer eligible as an eligible country to import skilled labor. So that becomes important to say, okay, well, maybe as an independent country or maybe a freely associated state, we could control our own border and bring in those workers. But again, there's some uncertainty. How do we know that we be able to bring those folks in? And then what about our current workforce? What about the people that live here? Are they going to be now replaced with foreign skilled workers? The good thing about the H-2B situation that we had is it's like a double-edged sword, at least for the contractors. On the one hand, you're curtailing the importation of foreign labor, which